Whether you're trying to get stronger legs, be able to pick up your kids off the ground, or even live longer, squatting is an essential exercise we all must master. A 2014 study showed that those who can get off the ground with as little support as possible tend to live longer. Those who needed less assistance with their arms tend to have a longer lifespan. So let's dive in on how to master this move so that you can perform better or live longer. My name is Dr. Shines Farr. I'm a doctor of physical therapy, a board-certified orthopedic clinical specialist, and the owner of Unity Physical Therapy. I'm also faculty at my graduate program, and I'm a professional stuntman, breakdancer, and a competitive martial artist. So what is a squat? A squat is essentially an exercise where you're bending your knees, ankles, and hips to lower yourself to the ground, almost as if you're about to sit down into a chair. It's a really popular exercise because it targets a lot of large muscle groups. It's incredibly functional for your day-to-day, and essentially you can do it anywhere. As a matter of fact, whether you worked out or not, it's likely that you might have done a squat already today. Now, there are a few different forms of squats, each have their own utility. Today, I want to talk about how you master an air squat or a good old back squat, because I think that's sort of the base of all of them. Although it's a pretty simple move, there's a few joints that need to make sure we have enough mobility, strength, we're turning on the right muscles, and we're syncing all that up to do it perfectly. So you might have seen in one of my previous videos that I like to use the FAST principle, which means flexibility, activation, strength, and timing. So let's start with flexibility in the squat to make sure that we have enough range of motion to get the job done. Now, although it's not a crazy flexible move like doing the full splits or some contortion, there are a few subtle nuances that can help us make sure we do this properly. Let's start with the easiest one. In order to do a full squat, we need to be able to fully straighten our knees and fully bend them. Bending your knee all the way basically means that the meat of your calf and your hamstring can touch. Straightening your knee means that there's a straight line from your ankle to your hip. And if you don't have that, we need to determine why is that stiff. Is it a mobility issue because the muscles are stiff, or is it that the joint capsule is stiff? The reason this is important is because they have two different things to prescribe to fix it. Generally, in this case, I often see that the restrictions are actually coming from joint capsules instead of the muscle. Depending on what your physical therapist finds, they might have you do some joint mobilizations, such as adding some extra pressure to your knee or putting a towel behind your knee when you're trying to bend it in order to get you that more mobility. When we're doing these knee flexion mobilizations, essentially that towel or object is creating a little wedge to gap the joint so that the knee can bend a little easier. We'll go to the next one, which is ankle mobility. Now, a squat requires a lot of dorsiflexion. That's bringing your toes towards your shin. And in order to do a full squat where your butt goes all the way to the ground, also known as an ass to grass squat, for most people, I want them to be able to reach 5 inches on this knee to wall test. However, everyone's anatomy is different. People have different bone lengths that might alter this. So although 5 inches is what I like to have the majority of my people aim for, that's not a golden 100% rule. The reason this is important is because you can see in this video, if I have stiff ankles, when I get to the bottom, my knee can't track forward anymore and my low back has to round. If I'm also picking up a heavy weight, this is a risk for me putting a lot of strain on my back and my discs. However, if let's say I give my ankles a little bit of extra room by putting a wedge under my shoes, you can see now that I can keep my back straight when I go all the way down. That's because I basically cheated by giving my ankles a head start in the mobility. If that's the case, where let's say your back rounds a lot when you do a squat, and then when you put a wedge under it fixes it, that's because likely you're not reaching the 5 inches on the knee to wall test, or if you do, your heel is coming off the ground. If that's the case, again, we need to dive in. Is it muscles or joint capsule that's limiting us? If one is doing the knee to wall test, and let's say they're at 3 inches, 4 inches, and they feel a stretch in their calf and Achilles, and that feels like that's what's limiting them, it's a good chance that it's muscle and that stretching will help correct this. If instead they feel a pinch in the front of their ankle, it's actually likely that the joint capsule needs some work. The talus, which is one of the bones in the ankles, is not gliding back enough, and because that's causing a little impingement in the ankle. Conventional stretching will not only not work, it might make it worse. Instead, this is where doing some hands-on work with a physical therapist, or you'll see some exercise where they take a band and traction that joint, will actually help a lot better. And then the last one is hip mobility. So in order to do a full depth squat, not only do we need to get our knees really high, but we actually need to make sure we have enough rotation, both internal and external, on our hips, because it's a good sign that our joint capsule has enough space for our hips to clear. On average, I want my athletes to have 45 degrees of both. However, people's anatomy in the hip is a little different. They have these different degrees of torsion in the hip, so that's where a physical therapist can really identify that for you. But I think sometimes people don't appreciate enough that if you're lacking, let's say, internal rotation, when you're trying to squat, your hip might not be able to take that load and has to shift to correct it. So as a summary, I like to have my athletes to have 5 inches on the knee to wall test, full flexion and extension of the knee, 120 degrees of hip flexion, and 45 degrees of hip internal and external rotation. Let's go to the A, which is activation. When we're doing a squat, it's a full body movement, unlike a bicep curl, so there's a lot of muscles that we can use. And honestly, we don't always choose the right ones, as silly as it seems. For instance, you can see that although I'm doing a squat in both of these cases, in one of them my knees are coming together, and another one my knees are pushing out. That's because you have multiple hip extenders, some that are adductors and some that are abductors, which basically means adductors are your knees coming together and abductors are your knees going away. You can also see that you can arch your back a lot to get up, which is using your back muscles, or I can keep my back straight, which means I'm stiffening my core and instead using my abdominals. Ideally, what we want to do is bias the glutes, our quads, and our abdominals, that our back is not doing a lot of strain, our knees aren't taking a lot of strain. Instead, we're getting these big, strong muscles that are also stabilizers to take the load. So we want to make sure that our quads are active, our glutes are active, and our abdominals are active. If we're struggling turning these muscles on before we squat, I like to do isometrics. So for instance, for the abdominals, I'll do like a 90-90 hold, trying to bring my knees up and my tailbone off the mat, so I feel my abs bracing and turning on. If my glutes feel like they're having a hard time, I'll do clamshell exercises to really get them fired, or a single leg bridge. And then with my quads, I'll do a single leg tempo squat hold against the wall just to get those quads burning. You don't need to do a lot, it's just so you feel those muscles turn on, so that when you go back to your squat, you feel those muscles working, so we're squatting with a little bit better form. Let's move on to the S, which is strength. Strength means basically how much those muscles can produce. Essentially, we might have good mobility and activation, but we're just not strong enough to do it with good form, let's say with an air squat or with weight on our back. Now, because a squat is a complex move where we're using multiple different muscles, it's not like if I want to do a 300-pound squat, 150 of my body weight plus 150 of the bar, I need one of my quads to be able to extend 300 pounds. My quads plus my glutes plus my calves plus everything needs to add up to my weight plus whatever weight I'm putting on the bar. I like my athletes to have their quads at least do 75% of their body weight, and their glutes to do about 50 to 75% of their body weight as well. I know that the quads and glutes are strong enough to tolerate the load of their body, and especially when we're at a bar, we're not limited by our strength causing bad habits. Now lastly is, how do we sync all this up? How do we time it well? Essentially with a squat, we always want to make sure that our hips lead. That's because our hips are the strongest muscle in the body. So we're starting to put a lot of heavy weight involved because our body might not be getting the recruitment of our hips to help with that load. So always let your hips bend first, and then even on the way up, I like to think about my hips pushing forward first. A lot of times people make the mistake of either letting their knees bend first on the way down, or on the way up, instead of driving with their hips, they drive with their head. This causes you to use your back muscles too much or put too much strain on your knees. Instead, think hips always first. So one drill I like to have my clients do, if that they're struggling with this, I have their back towards a wall, maybe about 6 inches away, and I just have them hinge at their hips till their butt touches the wall. Once they get that down where their legs are locked, their butt is just touching the wall back and forth, I'll have them touch the wall and let their knees bend a little bit, just to sort of initiate that movement and teach it correctly. Now, I hope that this analysis of this simple technique shows you all the nuances that I look for as a physical therapist, so that you can appreciate it more, so that you can train it better, and that way you can do it right and hopefully live a long, healthy, strong life. Stay tuned for more breakdowns on exercises, videos on injury recovery and performance enhancement. Follow us at Unity PTLA on Instagram, and go to our website, unityphysicaltherapy.com, for more questions. Thank you guys. See you on the next one.